Okay, so for number 34, we are going to write the sinusoidal equation for each of these following graphs. The sinusoidal graph can either be a sine or a cosine function, okay? Of course, cosine being the co-function of sine. In order to identify a sine or cosine, you have to identify A, B, C, and D. In this case, if you remember, A is always going to be your amplitude. Your amplitude is defined as half the height of your graph. The B value you use the period for. So in this case, you have to first identify the period, and your period is equal to 2 pi over B. And then you would have to solve that equation. So this is kind of used for B. Okay? The period, of course, is how long it takes to make one cycle, whether it's a sine cycle or a cosine cycle. Okay? So if you remember, a sine graph has the basic shape. It starts in the middle of your midline, goes up, comes back down, below the midline, and then back up to the midline. A negative sine graph is going to do just the opposite. It's going to start at the midline, it's going to go down first, then it's going to come back up across the midline above it, and come back down and end again at the midline. The cosine graph is going to start at the top of the graph, it's going to go down past the midline, dip below the midline, and come back up to complete one cycle. And then finally, your inverse cosine, or your negative cosine graph is going to start at the bottom, going to come up to the top, and then come back down and conclude at the bottom. So again, your midlines for all of these run like this. Here's your midline for this one, your midline for this one. Your midline is going to be in the middle of a cosine graph, and then the middle of a negative cosine graph. Okay, so those are all of your basic functions. And again, that's just so that you can determine the period. Alright, so let's get started on each of the problems now that we've identified all of those items. First of all, for A, the amplitude. Notice this graph goes from 3 to 7. So from 3 to 7 has a distance of 4. I then want to divide that in half, so my amplitude is 2. Remember, the amplitude is defined as half the height of the graph. So A is equal to 2. For B, I'm going to again use that 2 pi over B in order to solve for what my B value is. So the period in this case, you have to kind of decide where you are going to start this function. The easiest place to start this function is at your midline. So your midline in this graph is 5. So again, here's my midline that I'm going to cross. And if you notice, it starts right on the x-axis. It's easiest just to go ahead and start one cycle of the graph right on the x-axis. Or excuse me, on the y-axis. So this graph is going to start here at 5. It's going to go up and come back down below. So what basic function is that? Is that a sine, a cosine, a negative sine, or a negative cosine? Well, if I look over here at my shapes, I notice that that shape looks just like a sine graph. So I'm going to actually use a sine function for this graph. And if you remember, there are 4 possibilities for every graph. So if you are just identifying a function, you have 4 possibilities. It could be a sine, negative sine, cosine, or negative cosine. And that's for every single graph. You have all of those possibilities you could write 4 equations for. Alright, so let's go back over here to solving for B. So I know that my period is 2 pi because it goes from 0 to 2 pi. So I know that my period is equal to 2 pi, so I'm going to substitute that in for the word period. So period is 2 pi is equal to 2 pi over B. So to solve for B, I basically just interchange 2 pi and B, and I'm left with 2 pi over pi, and 2 pi over pi is equal to 1. So my B value is 1. For C, my C is my phase shift. So has this starting point that I determined going to be shifted left or right? And that's my phase shift. And the answer is no, it starts at 0. So therefore my C value is 0. Finally, my D value is how far up this graph is shifted, which is basically the midline. It's the halfway point of your graph. In this case, it's 5, so my D value is 5. If you want to calculate that, you take the high and low, you add them and divide by 2. So therefore your D value is 5. So that makes your equation. Now you're just going to fill that in, and your basic form is y equals the A value times the sine or cosine, in this case it's sine, of the B value times x plus the C value plus D. So let's plug all that in. A is 2, so I'm going to plug that in here. It's a positive 2 because this is a positive sine graph, so I don't need to worry about putting a negative on that 2. 2 times the sine. B is 1, so that's just a 1, times C is 0, so x plus 0 is just x, and 1 times x is just x. So therefore this simplifies to just x, and then my D value is 5, so plus 5. Alright, let's move on to letter B. Letter B of my graph, I am also going to make this a sine graph. The reason is because notice this starts right at the origin. That's where your midline is. What I like to do is to go ahead and draw in my top and bottom, and also then the midline, which you should always get in the habit of doing. So there's my top and bottom, and notice halfway between that is the x-axis, which is my origin. So I know in this case that it's not going to be shifted left, right, up, or down. It's just going to be at the origin. And again, if I start at the origin and trace this graph to the right, notice again the basic shape of this graph is a positive sine graph. So let's talk about the amplitude. The amplitude is half the height. The height goes from -3 to +3, which that's a height of 6, a total height of 6. Half of that is 3. So A is 3. B, again, I'm going to use the same concept of my period, however long my period is, equals 2 pi over the value of B and solve. So for this one, I would use my period, notice, goes from 0 to 2. So 2 equals 2 pi over B. Simplify again, interchange 2 and B, and you're left with 2 pi over 2. So therefore my B value is pi. We already talked about how C and D were both 0. So therefore now my equation is just 3 times the sine of pi x. Alright. Last one, letter C. Letter C, if I take a look at this graph, again this one is actually starting at the origin, it appears. Well, it doesn't really start at the origin. It goes through the origin. So let's find out where my midline is and what equation would work best for this graph. So I'm going to draw my tops and bottoms in, and then I'm also going to figure out halfway between. Well, this graph has a total height of 8. Halfway between is 4. So if I count down 4, notice that my midline goes right through 2. So in this case, I could actually use any graph I wanted. Now, since we've had 2 sine graphs, we're going to use cosine. Doesn't mean you couldn't use negative sine and start it here. Doesn't mean you couldn't use negative cosine and start it here. Okay, typically we want to start the equation at the closest point to the origin, which is to the right of the origin. So in this case, we're going to start the graph right here, or start looking at this from right here. It goes down and it comes back up. So what basic shape is that? That basic shape is a cosine graph. So we know that we're looking at a cosine graph. Alright, my amplitude is half the height. We already talked about how the height of the graph was 8 and half of that is 4. We again want to use our definition. And how far does this go from here to here? Okay, in this case, it doesn't really give you any labels here. So we're going to assume that it just goes for a cycle of 2 pi. So I have 2 pi over 2 pi. So B is 1 here. I don't need to worry about any kind of vertical stretch. B also represents your vertical stretch. C is going to be pi over 6. C is how far you are shifted, left or right. For some reason it seems like the labels got left off this graph, but it should give you a label here as well. And in this case it would be shifted because this would be the value of pi over 6 right here. Okay, so if this were pi over 6, you know that it starts at pi over 6, so it's shifted to the right pi over 6. And then finally your midline is at -2. So now I'm going to put all this information together. Amplitude A, 4. In this case I'm looking at a cosine shape, so cosine. My b value is 1, so I don't have to worry about that. X minus, since it moved to the right, it's the opposite, minus pi over 6. And then finally my vertical shift, which is negative 2. So if you had to describe these transformations, your description of this transformation would be a vertical stretch by a factor of 4. It would be a phase shift to the right, pi over 6, and it would be a vertical shift down 2. Okay, so if you had to, that's called describing. In this case, it doesn't say to describe them, but there is a possibility you may have to describe them.